Welcome to the Non-Essential Podcast. I'm Steve Gibson.
I'm Ben Matlock.
And I've got a big jug of Gatorade, so I'm ready for this week.
I got a big jug of moonshine, and that's actually standard operating procedure for this show.
I've noticed anymore, there's been a couple episodes recently where it's like, I don't have anything I have to have a drink when we do the show, because just to, lubricate your throat. And but there's a couple times that we don't really have anything easy to grab, so I'll just grab a beer, and by the end of the show, I'm like, I'm slurring. Like, it's ridiculous.
I went off the rails somewhere in this half hour, yeah. I haven't really drank much in, like, the last couple months, and I don't even bring a drink to do this show anymore. I just, like, I know it's time to wrap up once my voice starts going out, and...
Yeah, it has helped substantially since we, theoretically anyway, shortened the format.
Yeah, and it's just kind of an organic, like, okay, you're talking too much. And that's how I end conversations at parties. It's like, oh, mouth is dry, I gotta go. And then they never see me again. But anyway, we do a show. It's about topics, things, stuff. Unfortunately,
usually horrible things. Yeah.
Horrible things, and today won't be an exception to that. Today's story is a serial killer story, so if that sounds awful to you, we'll try again next week to keep you around for a show.
Yeah, if you don't want to listen to serial killer stories, send us an email and we'll tell you which, like, 80% of our episodes you can't listen to.
We'll tell you the 2 episodes that will be right up your alley. But anyway,
we've had a lot that, like, aren't even technically serial. Like, you wouldn't find them in a book about serial killers, but they were serial killers.
Yeah. This guy, today's subject is serial killer as fuck. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do what we talked about last week. I couldn't find a real interesting, like... Well, there was an interesting guy who killed bad people. Like, there are stories of serial killers who just kill, like, criminals.
Yeah, like vigilante. Like,
rapists and shit. And, like... But those stories, like, there wasn't a lot of, like, depth to them, really. It was just kind of like, yeah, he did that shit and now he's in jail. But people kind of like him because he killed bad people. It's like, all right.
We were hoping to find a serial killer that ran into another serial killer, and, like, one of the two got serial killed.
Yeah, a serial killer competition, because that's how fucked these conversations get on this show. Peter Kurten, aka the Dusseldorf Vampire, aka the Dusseldorf Monster, and that's where the nicknames end. They came up with 2.
Yeah, but, like, we just spoke for like 5 minutes about where this is headed, and it's a terrible, serial killer. But when your nickname contains the town Dusseldorf, it really lessens the
Dumbledore.
Like,
vampire.
If I got a letter in the mail saying I am going to kill you, and you're like, oh my god, no, and then signed the Dusseldorf Monster, I'd be like, ha ha.
From Hogwarts. Yeah. So Peter Kurten was born in Cologne, Germany on May 26, 1883. As you can imagine, those nicknames were completely ironic. He was a cool guy, a very friendly, warm individual who loved people, and people loved him. And that's the end of the story this week, so thank you for listening.
He started
Goodbye.
a kitten orphanage, and everything went well.
Yeah, no, he was a fucking piece of shit. We have done serial killer stories on this show before. Maybe it's just because this feels like the furthest I went into one of them, but this guy really just, like, there's some twists in the story, and that's why I picked it, but he's just fucking awful.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of serial killers, that's why they get, like, the TV shows and stuff. They're charismatic, and, like, they're able to kind of hide their double life, and a lot of people are surprised when they find out. They're like, he was so likable, but then there's, like, the ones that are just dicks, like,
right. And we'll get to why. Once we get to kind of the ending of the story, we can kind of talk about it a bit more. So Kurten was the third of 13 children, which is just like, already, like, how do people fucking live like that? How did they do it back then with that many fucking kids? The answer in Kurten's case was they didn't do it, i.e. parenting. Because his parents were abusive alcoholics. They would beat and abuse Peter and his siblings. And for some reason often forced them to watch the two have sex. His dad was
Which
especially...
they obviously frequently did with 13 kids. I mean,
yeah, they were apparently good at it. Like, kids, you gotta know what you're doing, and me and your mom know what we're doing. His dad was especially a piece of shit and was imprisoned for 3 years after molesting Peter's 13-year-old sister. So Peter was sort of slingshot into this violent household that normalized sexual and physical abuse. And as a young child, I'm sure this will all turn out fine for him. Mm-hmm. So before his teen years, Peter started to engage in fucked up shit that would be a red flag to anybody reasonable. Before the age of 10, he attempted to drown a playmate, and he even claims that during this time he killed 2 other schoolmates. And he befriended a local dog catcher who we should also probably know more about than we do, because this sick fuck taught Peter how to torture and kill the animals he caught. But we don't know that prick's name, which means he probably got away with a lot of fucked up shit, and Peter took the heat off him.
Yeah. Eddie? Unfortunately, those kind of jobs, especially back then, drew those people that, like, there are people that animals are just things to, like, lord over the fact that you're a human by, like, being awful to them.
Right. And, you know, this kind of animal abuse or whatever, like, it's not a reoccurring thing in all serial killers, but it early on, especially as serial killers started to become more well-known. And in Peter's case, you know, we're talking late 1800s, early 1900s. At first, this was like a common, like, he abuses animals, he must be a serial killer. At 13, Peter got into a relationship with a girl around his age, but she wasn't ready to have sex with him. They were kids still. And so Peter did what any young boy would do at that point with sexual frustrations: bestiality at local farm animals.
Well, that's oddly slightly less terrible than where I thought you were going with it, but...
Well, he when talking about this time, he admitted that to achieve an orgasm, he needed to mutilate the animals.
Wow.
This behavior didn't stop until a farmer noticed him stabbing a pig, which seems pretty laid back for it to end that unceremoniously. Like, the farmer just like, "Hey, quit stabbing that pig, you little shit." and then the farmer just goes back inside. And he's like, "Curtain boy came back to fucking murder pigs again, little whippersnapper." Yeah, it's... So, a few years later, Peter stole all the money in his home and ran away to start a relationship with a prostitute 2 years older than him. So he clearly read my book, Ben's Big Book to Easy Success. He would end up in jail for a month after the theft and another 4 years in prison for fraud. In 1904, he got drafted into the army, but deserted almost immediately. He then began committing random acts of arson to watch from a distance as emergency teams would respond, which is a weird way to lay low when you just deserted the military.
Yeah, but, man, it's one of the things that the show, to me, has made so apparent is how much easier it was to get away with this stuff back then. I mean, even really up until relatively modern times, because there weren't cameras and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, but unfortunately, a reoccurring theme for Peter's story is that he gets caught a lot, just not for the worst shit. So he was eventually caught for this and brought back to be tried by the military for his desertion on top of the arson. It was during this imprisonment he claimed he took a lot of punishment and abuse from other people in the prison, and it kind of got combined with these erotic fantasies that he said made him orgasm spontaneously. So he's getting reformed, right? This is
right.
This is a work in progress, but it's trending right in the right direction. He was released in 1913 and moved to Mulheim am Rhein and began a devastating string of murders in Germany. No longer satisfied with buying prostitutes and killing animals, and really just undeterred from committing basic theft crimes after his time in prison, he attempted to burgle a home in his neighborhood. And again, this is your chance to stop the show if you don't like the details of these murders. I try not to dive into all the graphic detail, but I do try to tell you what happened. When he happened upon the owner's 9-year-old daughter, he was overcome by these erotic fantasies he developed and strangled her and slashed her throat. The next day, he was... model German citizen here. Doing the country proud. The next day, he returned to the scene by hitting up a tavern across the street from the house. Locals talking about the horrific crime he was responsible for gave him this adrenaline rush and high that he just reveled in. Over the months, he would routinely visit the girl's grave and touch the soil for the sexual release of it. He would repeat this crime 2 months after that murder on a 17-year-old girl in basically the same fashion. After that, he went to jail again for arson and burglary. Because, fuck, this dude just... he could not get enough crime.
The worst stuff, but yeah.
It's like, yeah, like he's really, like, checking off shit as far as, like, how to not be a human being. After 8 years in prison, he entered into an unhappy engagement with a woman named August Scharf, who was a shop owner and a former prostitute. August had previously been accused of fatally shooting her former fiancé, and to get out of it, she needed somebody to pose as this fiancé, and Peter needed to pretend to be somebody else in order to evade arrest a lot of the time, so it all worked out. But Peter was far from a faithful partner, and when August realized he was banging 2 of their maids, she encouraged one to press charges, claiming Peter forced her to engage in this. The charges held, and Peter went in for another 6 months. August and Peter still got married after this.
Well, he learned that, he can change.
Yeah. After his release, Peter got back into his sick murder spree. In just a month, he murdered 2 more people and attempted a third, but the woman survived her injuries. His method was usually the same, torturing through strangulation and finishing them off with sharpened scissors. And he often would come back to the crime just to shoot the shit with the police about it, under the guise of being a concerned citizen. He had 4 women escape him over the next several months, and then in August of 1929, he went on a spree that overtook Germany with fear, and ultimately this is when the papers would give him the nickname of Vampire and Monster. Over the course of just a month, he murdered 6 people. The first woman he stalked for a week, with a vague idea of crucifying her to a decomposing tree in order to cause a scene and a public panic. But I guess that seemed like a lot of work to Peter, because he ultimately just gave up on it and just buried her and wrote the police a letter with a map to where they could find the body.
Then why bury her?
Well, you still got to do something, Yeah. It's stupid. After writing the letter, which was just full of bullshit to throw the police off his trail, he switched to a knife from his signature pair of scissors. During this stretch, he also just, I guess to test it out, randomly stabbed 3 people, but all 3 people somehow remembered the attacker differently and gave the police little to go on.
That's a pretty common, especially if you're the one that just got fucking stabbed.
Right. But, I'm not really, remembering, what color your eyes were or some shit.
There was a...
I'm trying to keep pressure on it.
A psychological... I forget what they called it, but we learned about it in police academy, but they do it in psych classes and stuff as well, where they'll have a classroom full of students, and then they'll have somebody bust in the middle of class and pretend to be a criminal. I think in the past they've used it like they were going to be violent, but that hopefully they're smart enough to stay away from that now.
Yeah.
But anyway, they interview all the the people in the classroom afterwards, and you'd get like 30 different descriptions of the person, because it catches you off guard and it's quick, and then they're gone, and you just remember random things.
And that's why, like, you know, like eyewitness testimony and shit is not. We like to think like that's like the nail in a coffin in like a big murder case or something, but it's really not as reliable as you would think, because and like a defense attorney will be the first one to try to point out every possible way you would not be able to accurately remember who was responsible, who you thought you saw.
Right.
So 3 days after those stabbings, Peter murdered a pair of sisters and went to cross another item off the evil piece of shit bucket list and engaged in cannibalism by drinking their blood.
Was he still using the knife at this point, or?
Yeah.
Because I'm a little disappointed that he didn't murder a pair of sisters with a pair of scissors.
I know, he fucked up. You could have made this a fun murder spree, Peter.
Dr. Seuss's... One kill, two kills, red kill, blue kill. I don't know.
I like to think Dr. Seuss's books were all about murders he had committed. Next month, he committed his final murders. He bludgeoned 2 servant girls with a hammer and stabbed a child and left that body in an alleyway. So we get to how he got caught, and this is really what made me want to tell the story, because up to this point it is just an unpleasant, like, another murderer. But this is a really fucked up situation that kind of... So Germany at this point is just in a panic about this vampire who's roaming the streets. Nobody knows who he is. And everybody's kind of on edge, like how we would be if we heard there was a serial killer in our area. You're locking your doors. You try not to go out alone. So in 1930, a woman named Maria Budlick had moved to Peterstown and responded to an advertisement offering a place to stay. She knew about the killer, and she was appropriately cautious to go meet this man who was running the ad. But she did it, and she was just going to make sure they stayed on, busy streets and whatnot. But as the two were walking, the man insisted that they cut through an alleyway to get to where she was going to presumably stay. Maria immediately became startled and refused, just convinced this man was a serial murderer. The man took great exception to being accused of such horrors, and the two began to argue and yell about it. When a third man, Peter Kurten, stepped in to save Maria from her predicament. He took her back to his home, but when Maria refused to sleep with him, he took her back to a train station and raped her in the nearby woods. He later claimed he didn't kill Maria because she didn't, quote, fight back. As hard as it still is to come forward on rape accusations now, it was way fucking more difficult back in 1930, as far as, like, actually getting anything out of it. Like, most cops probably respond to, like, how some do now, where it's like, well, what do you want me to do?
Yeah, or what you were asking for. Like, how do we know you didn't,
Just that type of bullshit, ramped up to about 10. And Maria would not end up going to the authorities about what happened to her. Instead, she wrote a letter describing the event to a friend of hers. Somehow that letter ended up getting delivered to the wrong address, and I guess you just opened other people's mail then, because the person who got the letter decided to read it, and, horrified, turned it into the police. The police contacted Budlick and got the full story, and immediately went to Peter's home for answers. Peter and August had snuck away before this point, but the Great Depression was beginning to hit, full stride, and Peter became oddly concerned about August's well-being. If he were to disappear somehow, she would be pretty fucked, and he decided that the only financial way to keep her okay was to confess to her about his crimes. Up to this point, August thought he was just a cheating asshole, and now she's learning that, turns out you're the fucking killer that everyone's afraid of. He explained to her that there was a reward out for his arrest, and should she turn him in to claim it, she would have something to live off of when he gets put away. She did just that, probably with very little argument.
Yeah, because at that point you kind of assume you're on borrowed time. It's just
well, I mean, also like August, like they didn't like each other anyway, you know, like
right.
So like it was a total marriage of like scam and convenience, and then when it's like, oh, turns out you're on the hook for a ton of murders. So Peter got turned in, and he confessed to 68 crimes, including 10 murders and 31 attempted. He tried to justify his actions, claiming a societal revenge for the horrors he endured during his childhood. Police ordered a psychological evaluation, which would be the first ever performed on a sexual serial killer. And they were kind of shocked when the psychologist was like, despite all the sick, despicable shit and fantasies that happened with Peter Kurten, he was well aware of what he was doing and perfectly sane to stand trial for his crimes. He maintained
You got to wonder, though, like if he actually was, or if back then they're just like, this guy needs to go to jail. Well, I don't know.
Well, that's we've talked about it before. The tricky thing about like insanity defenses is like your insanity almost has to be a particular type where like
because
like,
no sane person would like do these crimes. So obviously there's something wrong with them. I think the key, and it shockingly sounds like what they were looking for back then is not like, oh, is there something wrong with this person? Because obviously, but it's like, did they understand that what they were doing is wrong?
Right. And that's part of insanity pleas today. Like it is, there has to be a convinced, like you either have to like completely not know what the concept of murder is. And that's how you get like those insanity pleas where people are like, no, we weren't killing them. We were releasing them into, you know, the celestial cosmos or something, right. You know, like, and trying to make that case. Or you have to like not understand like the gravity of what murder is, and that it is, you know, an atrocious crime. And where serial killers don't really get away with it is that, like, you know, they know what they're doing. They're trying to cover it up to keep doing it. You know, like they know it's wrong. They just don't give a shit. But you're right. There is like, you can't hear Peter's story and be like, oh, he's fine. Yeah, he knew. It's like robbing a bank, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two parts of that. You obviously don't hear it say he's fine, but the part of him that's broken, you don't hear it say, well, he deserves to be not in prison. Like,
right, no, like this is a guy that, like, needs, you know, medical treatment as opposed to this is a guy that needs to be, you know, locked away from society.
Right.
He maintained in court that he had no conscience and therefore no pity for his victims, again falling back on how hard he had it growing up, which is pretty much just a line when serial killers pull that shit. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't make like what happened to him not wrong, but it happens to a lot of people. They don't
exactly like. I kind of saved it for the tail end, but considering he had 12 other siblings who didn't go on to murder people, as far as we know. Not to mention, like, the countless other people in the world who have shitty childhoods, who don't go on to become serial killers. Like, environment and growing up and, like, nurture is a factor sometimes, but it's not a guaranteed factor. And that's what's kind of fucked up about serial killers and makes it hard for society to get really a read on them, is that they're all so fucking different as far as like circumstances of upbringing and what could be going on in their head. You know, so like Peter's just a sick fucking person, and like you can't say like a tough childhood is the sole reason for it. So the trial lasted 10 days. They debated his motives, the crimes themselves, and what his punishment should be before a jury ultimately declared him guilty, and he was, quote, awarded with 9 death sentences by guillotine. A new record.
I hope that means that they dropped the guillotine 9 times. Like,
yeah, we cut your head off 9 times. We sew it back on and do it again. So, laying his head in place, Peter supposedly said, as his final words, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasure." And I have to imagine the executioner was like, "No, it won't be like that at all. Shut up," and then dropped the blade. As doctors examined his brain, they were kind of shocked to find there's like no abnormalities in his brain as far as they could tell. Like nothing.
I love this
nothing
idea that
drastic.
We're 100% sure that they could physically see, because we're like you said, we're talking early 1900s. It's not like, oh, we're microscopically, before we killed him, we're in a CAT scan or this or that. It's just like, we assume his brain will look different.
Like you're going to pop his head open and see like the Jolly Roger flag on one part of the brain or something. Like, oh, there's the evil.
There it is. There it is. That's...
But I mean, like you can look up like brains and shit. Like, I watched that Aaron Hernandez documentary, and when they examined his brain, it was like super fucked up, mostly because of football. But,
right.
It also... like you can find those abnormalities in people where it would be like, oh, well, this region of the brain is noticeably like shrunken or deformed somewhere, and that might be an explanation. But in this case, it was like, this looks like every other fucking brain we've ever looked at. And so again, Peter was just kind of a sick fuck. So yeah, we'll probably never have like a clear set of answers when it comes to like how much is like a serial killer just naturally that fucking evil, and how much did their environment and upbringing come into developing it.
Sound like in the beginning that there was, obviously the factors were bad, like you said, the brothers and sisters and other kids that come up in that don't all turn out to be serial killers, although violence and that continued patterns of abuse are seen in those situations. But then meeting up with a guy that like gets pleasure out of torturing animals, and then kind of getting into that yourself, but never facing any real consequences for it. Like there was a lot that you could kind of see it building. But like you said, it's curious. Like, is it 100% that? Like if he was born to a family that like took him skiing on winter break and treated him well, would he have been 100% different or what? I don't know.
Like I think that's the the tricky thing with serial killers is it seems like no matter how they turn out, it's always this perfect storm of like, okay, yeah, that was fucked up, and then they were already naturally fucked up, and now it just set off this fucking chain reaction that turned into this horrible fucking time for, various communities.
Yeah, like this is kind of a sidetrack, but it reminds me of the whole debate about like video games causing violence, and it's like, do they really? Obviously they don't with the way that we've been around and covered it. I'm 100% that video games don't cause violence. However, if you're prone to it, I can see you being drawn to the violence of video games, and then that kind of feeding into a loop, sure.
Right.
So, and then if you take it from an entertainment form to your actual life, like if you're prone to that, and then you're getting beaten and abused, and so it's curious, but I am certainly no people scientist. P psychologist. I think you pronounce the P.
A picologist. I am a picologist.
My favorite part about the story, though, is just this idea that he had 2 nicknames, the Dusseldorf Monster and the Dusseldorf Vampire, because in my head, I'm picturing that the area had 2 main newspapers, and like one named him one thing, and the other is like, fuck it, we're naming him. And then they were like,
fuck that.
As the town is like terrified by violence, they're in this like heated like war to see whose nickname's gonna win.
Yeah. You and me have been doing this show way too long. I knew exactly where you were going to go with that. Like, it totally, it's just like, I want to think like, you know, Monster probably came out first because it's just, like, Vampire's just like, just a pissy little passive-aggressive step up to a more specific monster.
Right.
And like the first paper's like, fuck you guys. How do you know he's a vampire? He drank blood once.
Well, the part you don't hear, the local college paper tried to call him the Dusseldorf, like, lichen or something, and everyone's like, no, that's too...
There was a third paper, the first ones to get to the story, and they just called him the Dusseldorf serial killer. And they got washed away. Like, that's not how you're going to sell papers, dipshit.
There's a Simpsons episode where I forget what's going on, but there's some like big media circus trial about to happen, and it's the one where Mayor Quimby's nephew gets accused of beating up a waiter, and it was called something stupid. He's like, you know, I think it was called like beat up waiter gate or something, and he's like, this reporter suggested Waitergate, but was laughed out of the media room.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that's that. As soon as you said that, I was waiting until the end of the show. I'm like, part of my brain's listening to the story, and the other part's just picturing these two
imagining.
Papers,
yeah, that's like the Peter Kurten movie is actually doesn't really follow him at all. It would just be about these two newspapers trying to one up each other.
It's not like a horrible killer movie. It's a drama about, the newsroom.
Directed by Wes Anderson.
I'd watch it.
You see the trailer for his new movie?
I did not. I saw that it one's out there, and it's kind of one of those. He's in that place, and I hate to sound like one of these because we were talking before we started recording. I'm not the best at like watching movies. In fact, I don't think there was a single movie mentioned in the Oscars that I've seen. So that's how far behind I am on stuff. But Wes Anderson's one of those guys. Every time he releases a movie, I know I'm going to watch it. I don't necessarily like love every one of his movies, right? But I'm drawn to that style. Like, I'm always curious enough that I want to see it.
Yeah, and like, there's at least even the movies I don't like. Like, I wasn't the biggest fan of Moonrise Kingdom, but like, they're always visually interesting enough, and like you can get something out of pretty much every Wes Anderson movie.
Well, he's got one of my favorite styles of comedy that's just that, like, not outright comedy. Like, it's funny because it's the kind that my wife doesn't get really at all. It's like, I don't get it, there was no joke there. I'm like, but that's kind of the joke, like, that these people are just weird and quirky.
The joke is the universe that these characters are operating in and who they are.
And I actually liked Moonrise Kingdom, but even when, like, I forget the one that's like kind of a take off of a Jacques Cousteau character. I can't think of the name of it right now. But I had to watch it like 3 times. The first 2 times I didn't even make it through the movie, and then the third time I watched it, and I'm like, yeah, it clicked. It's not like I'm going to be falling out of my chair, rolling on the floor, laughing, but like it's just absurd.
That's kind of how I feel about the Darjeeling Limited, where it's like it took me a few tries to watch that movie, but now I really love it. But yeah, so the moral of this story is don't kill people or kill animals or rape people or whatever. Go see a Wes Anderson movie and
watch other people kill people. And
but in different ways. You know, it's not nearly the same.
Lighthearted murder.
Death is not nearly as heavy when it's shot in a quirky manner. You know. Anywho, yeah, that's the show, and this has been the show, and next week there will be a different show, and this will just be history, you know. They're like, and who can say it even really happened? We'll just be remembering that this show happened. So, the only show that actually exists is the show we're doing right now.
I'm kind of thinking the opposite, that this whole like 10-year run of the video game podcast and now this podcast is really just one small chapter in one of our biographies when we go off the rails and do something that 30 years from now somebody else is podcasting about. They'd be like, they should have known. If even one person had listened to these podcasts, they would have seen the red flags. But alas.
As sad as it is, I kind of look at this podcast as like the prologue chapter for some really like if I had a 30-year prologue before my life got interesting.
So, yeah. Tune in for more of it next week. Yeah.
Next week, more prologue. Bye.